Hello, I'm Tommy Waller. I'm a Christian Zionist. I had a volunteer program in Israel called HaYovel, Helping Agriculture, and I'm excited about today's program.
And I'm Kimberly Traup. I'm the U.S. Director of Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, and I am a Christian Zionist.
And I'm Sandra Osterbaris. I'm the Israel Director of Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, and I am an Orthodox Jew and an Israeli. Today's program, I think, is going to be really interesting because we are going to be exploring together our various customs that have to do with death and mourning. And we will probably also be exploring some thoughts that we each have about this, what death is and in Christian and Jewish traditions. And this whole program was the idea of Kimberly. Kim, why don't you begin by saying, why is it that you wanted to share this topic between us today?
Well, a couple of things happened. One, I think I just started out, my very first memory that I can really remember of losing someone close was when I lost my grandmother when I was 19 years old. And just that grief process that I went through, contrasting that as I became friends with you and came to Israel and watched people going through all kinds of tragedy and all kinds of, just normal loss too, just old age and it just happens. Just contrasting my experiences with that, with what I saw happening with Jews sitting Shiva and just the entire grief and mourning process. So that's one thing. Number two was we had a situation not too long ago, unfortunately, where your son's father-in-law passed away tragically. And we were together when that happened, and we had this whole conversation, and he was kind of freaking out, and you were kind of freaking out. And I was like, okay, well, we knew it was, what's the big deal? And you said to me, I've never seen a dead body. My son has never seen a dead body. And I was like, oh, I've seen lots of dead bodies. I mean, just what a difference of the way that we grieve our dead and how we deal with that. And then probably the third thing that prompted it is as your parents have aged, you and I have had some real conversations of what if you're traveling in the States, what if you're in Australia and God forbid one of your parents should pass away? What does that mean for you? And how are we going to deal with that? And, what is the expectation on my part? And how do we do with this? So that's kind of where this is coming from. So I think I hear Tommy has a little bit different background on mourning. I would say mine is probably pretty traditional, what everybody's gone through. You usually have most of the time or a lot of the time maybe have funerals with open caskets. Just that's how I grew up. So I don't know which one of you wants to take it away and say.
Let me, step in here and just kind of give an overview, because I'm sure most of the people in our audience really don't have any awareness of what the Jewish customs with regard to death and mourning are. So let me just kind of respond to some of the issues you raised, Kim, by explaining to people where we're coming from. So first of all, death is certainly viewed as a death of a loved one. Is definitely viewed as a very difficult event. I have to say, thank God, I have never lost a member of my immediate family. So I can't speak from that kind of experience. My husband's father did pass away, and so I could see what he was dealing with. But of course, I have many, many friends who have lost their parents and members of the community. So we're certainly aware of what is done. And the first thing is we bury our dead. We never cremate our dead, and we bury them right away. Right. Now, the original Jewish custom is to bury the same day, and that remains the predominant custom in Israel, where unless somebody dies late at night, we bury the same day. And in some communities in Israel, you will even bury at night. Others, they will not bury at night. They will only, let's say, bury during daylight. And if it's already dark, they'll wait till the next morning. But I've been at several funerals at night. So that's, and really, what's the source? And here I just want to bring in a little biblical reference. What is the source for that? And that's in Deuteronomy 21, verse 23. Okay, this is actually talking about someone who has been convicted, and there's a death penalty because of a crime he's committed, and the court has hung him. All right, and that's in the Bible. That's the context. But then what does it say? It says, "You must not let his corpse remain on the stake overnight, but must bury him the same day. For an impaled body is an affront to God. You shall not defile the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess." So imagine this kind of care is important for someone who's a convicted criminal of a very serious capital crime. How much more so are we commanded to have that kind of respect for the deceased by burying them the very same day? And also you can see here, you mentioned about seeing dead bodies. Well, it says here that when a body is hanging on the tree, in other words, exposed to everybody, that's considered a desecration of God's name. And that goes back to the fact that, as the Bible tells us, man is created in God's image. And when man has died and his essential spirit has left his body, that's how we see death. You know, death, after death, the spirit moves on to a spiritual world, to heaven, or however you want to define that. And what remains is just the body without the soul. But that body still represents the image of God that it was before death. And therefore, you have to treat it with utmost respect. And that means covering it, and that means burying it as quickly as possible. And we also don't bury in a casket. We bury just wrapped in a shroud and put straight in the earth. Now, many of you if any of you have gone to Jewish funerals outside of Israel, you will say, one second, no, they never bury the same day, they bury the next day, or they have a casket. Well, all that is because of state law. Because in these countries, there are laws that say you need to have a casket. So in a Jewish funeral, the caskets will be the plainest possible, because the casket is just something you need to do. But it's not supposed to, there shouldn't be this kind of barrier between the body and the earth. So the casket has to be very plain. And you still, of course, cover the body. And the reason you have to wait till the next day is because all these state laws, going back to the time where weren't sure if somebody was dead or not, they didn't want to risk, burying somebody alive. So there were these laws that said you had to wait till the next day to bury. So if you're Jewish and you're living, in the state of Ohio in the United States, where I'm from, you had to follow those rules. But that's not the original Jewish rules. That were accommodations that had to be made. And then, of course, following the burial, there's a 7-day mourning period where the immediate family, which is the children, the siblings, and the parents of the deceased, sit in the house, usually in the house of the deceased, and they sit there, literally sitting on low stools. At the funeral, the mourners have their shirt ripped as a sign of mourning. And they sit on low stools, not wearing shoes, usually wearing slippers or, socks or whatever. All of these things are signs of mourning, and they don't leave the house. And then people come in to visit them. And they are available to be visited from morning till evening. Prayer services are carried out in the house because the mourners do not leave to go to the synagogue. So there's always a community effort to make sure there is a quorum for the prayer services 3 times a day. And they're not supposed to do anything. They're completely passive, which means the community gets involved in ensuring there's food. And in fact, there's usually, all these signups and lists, I'll take care of breakfast, I'll take care of lunch, so people bring in food, and the mourners are served. They're not supposed to go and get up and even make themselves an egg, so there's always people there running the house of mourning, and their job is to make sure things are organized and constantly coming up to the mourners to say, can I get you a drink? Can I get you lunch? And that kind of thing. And of course, cleaning up and doing all the dishes and everything, because the mourner does nothing. He just sits.
But grieve. They grieve.
But the other thing, and I'll end with this custom, but I think it's a fabulous custom, and people that I know that have sat Shiva, which is the word for this, who have gone through this experience, say how they find these rules so helpful to them. The people coming in to visit are not supposed to start a conversation.
Right.
You're supposed to follow the lead of the mourner. And that means if the mourner doesn't want to talk,
then you just sit
and he
there.
doesn't want to hear you talk, you need to honor that. So if the mourner just sits there and does nothing and doesn't even acknowledge you, then you sit there and you do nothing. And if the mourner wants to hear you talk, the mourner will say, so tell me, how are you doing today? That's your opening. And if the mourner wants to talk to you about the deceased and wants to tell stories, you will. And you will get this sense also very often. It's usually a good thing for people coming to visit to tell stories to the mourners what they know of the deceased. And very often that's considered a very comforting thing. Now, that doesn't mean people sit and cry all day at the Shivas. Very often there's lightness and stories and people, remember, and of course, a lot depends on the situation. If you're going to, comfort someone, unfortunately, this was a terrible thing I remember most vividly when I went to pay a Shiva call to my dear, dear friend, Deborah Applebaum, whose husband and daughter were murdered the night before that daughter was supposed to get married. There's nothing to say.
Nothing.
What do you say? You come and you sit and there's nothing to say. And it's a very different situation if you go to visit a friend who, your friend who was in their 60s and their parents were in their 90s, just passed away, who had a good life. And, that's a whole different kind of thing because people die, and it's still sad because everybody is always sad to lose their parents, but it's not tragic.
Right.
It's just sad. So that I would say in a nutshell, and I talk too much already, is
No,
I think we're wanting to hear this because I think a lot of our listeners and viewers to this program are, very interested in what the Jewish customs are. Absolutely. And I think for me, it was refreshing to me. I don't know, Kim, it seems like in the Christian community, once the body is buried, because we're kind of mourning up until the grave ceremony.
Yep.
And once the grave ceremony happens, it's like, okay, we're done, and that's been my experience in across my, different variations of what we're doing. There's not a time to what I really appreciated being here in Israel and being around. And unfortunately, a lot of the Shivas that I participated in have been tragedy. There've been terrorist involvement and lives that were cut short. And I remember going to Itamar Bengal's place. I think somebody that you were close to, he was a teacher.
My son taught with Itamar and they were very good
right.
friends. Yeah.
So I remember going to Shiva and reading the letter from the U.S. ambassador and able to just kind of be a representation of the U.S. And I think it's good it was good for me because I feel like that there was there was a process that where you're not just all of a sudden somebody dies, boom, 3 days later and you're done with it. There's this process that I hear in the Jewish community. So we're talking about this 7-day mourning period, but it actually goes even further than that. I mean, there's this month period and there's year period and then there's every year period. What a great tradition, I think, that within the Jewish community that there's this continuation of honoring your family, your family members. I'm always hearing my friends here in Israel saying, well, this weekend we're going to honor my great grandfather or my grandfather's, the memory of it's the anniversary of his death. And so we're all gathering, our whole family's gathering to do that. I don't see that in Christianity. It's not something that we do, but it is something that we've actually kind of taken on ourselves. That thank God we've not had the tragedy in our family, to have that, or we've not lost a loved one since we started coming into this Israel, or at least a very close one, and we've been very fortunate in that. But I really feel like it's something very important that we process, the death of a family, of a close family member, or even our friends. The way that you process that, and it was really good, because I think that for us as Christians, we've kind of fallen. I don't know if it's always been like this, because I think that probably obviously in the old days, we probably did. I lived in an Amish community for a while. One of my, kind of extravagant deals that my family took off on before we actually started the Israel. We actually lived in an Amish community, which is basically stepping back, 100 years or 150 years for most people, and the way it used to be done. And it was like that. You didn't have, you had to bury your dead. You had to bury them quickly. There wasn't embalming, and there wasn't this sterile atmosphere. You had to. There was this grieving time. There was a community, a place for the community to come together and to be a part of that. But yet, I don't think that we made it in Christianity such a strong tradition like the Jewish community has, so that we kept doing it after everything became sterile. It was, I use the word sterile because now, but when the person dies in the hospital, you barely are, not even, you're having this visitation, but he's everything, nothing is done by the family or nothing. You're just in this, basically in a room with the body for, say, 2 or 3 days, and then then you have a burial, and it's done. And there's no, sometimes, a lot of times, depending on the death, there is an open casket where people view the body, that's not something you would never in Judaism. You would never see a dead body, right? Yeah. It's not like, it's just not allowed. It's not allowed in the, yeah. So, there were, I don't, every time I've been involved in it, it's been, and set Shiva with with the Jewish family. I appreciate that you just said this, because this is something I don't know that I knew it. I always get this kind of, when I'm usually going with another Jewish person, and so they're kind of like filling me in on what I'm supposed to do, what's allowed,
Right.
well, like I don't want to do something stupid here, but I like that, following the lead, because um, I appreciated my Jewish friends telling me, because I would have gone in there going, I got some. I want to make you feel good. And is there something I can say? And is there something I can do? And that would have been, not appropriate. And I think that I like that, because it is honoring the emotions of the moment, because the horrific situations that I have seen over the last 15, 16 years that I've been here in Israel. Unfortunately, they were almost all tragedies, where, and I always liked that, because it was, I mean, I liked having the opportunity, even as a non-Jew, that the Jewish people were appreciative of even non-Jews coming by and just visiting them, and even, like you said, not saying anything, but just being there. There wasn't ever, I never went to a place where somebody was upset that I would be there, and it was always just taken as a very a special thing that anyone could do. I don't care who you were. If you were coming to visit a Shiva, it was always a good thing, no matter who you were. It seemed to be always a good thing. So, and I really appreciated that. So that was my kind of take on that. But
Yeah, I
it
would second that big time, Tommy, because, with my experience, like I remember when my grandmother passed away, exactly that. I was her caretaker for the year before she passed away. So like going up to the funeral, of course, by that time, all of her children came in, my aunts, my uncles, my mom, and took care of like all the details. But I was still the responsible one that had been there. And then she passed away, the funeral, everybody goes their way. We clean out her house, take care of all of the stuff that has to be taken care of. And it was about 4 months later, and I found myself at the cemetery sitting at her grave, and I am just weeping and just like this overcome with grief. And I was just like, where did this come from? And I didn't, and I just said, well, clearly haven't grieved her, clearly I didn't process that during that time. And years later, as I came to Israel, it wasn't that many years, and we had this conversation, and I heard about this whole tradition of sitting Shiva, and, you don't even take a shower, right? I mean, like once you sit Shiva, you don't brush your teeth, you don't take a shower, you're yuck. You just are yuck for like 7 days. And, but yet I felt like that was so, I could see how that would be so healthy of you just really sit there and you really, the expectation, this was, I think, the biggest difference that I saw is, and this is a conversation that you and I have had, Sandra, is the expectation is that you don't do anything, like it would be, I don't even know a word strong enough. Like if you were to keep working, we had this conversation. We had a friend. We had a friend that was in Israel on tour, touring Israel, and his mother passed away. And he just continued on with his tour and, whatever, because, the funeral's not for 2 months because the family can't get together. And, she's in a nursing home, she was elderly. It was one of those situations. And it was very common, like I didn't see anything wrong. And you were absolutely horrified. Like just his mother.
That kind of experience happened to me a few times. I remember one time a Christian friend was visiting Israel, and I saw her. It wasn't a tour that I was running, but I was speaking at one of, for the tour, and she comes up to me and I said, "How are you?" She goes, "Oh, my father just died." I said, "Oh, terrible." And she says, "Yeah, I'm here in Israel, and the funeral is going to be when I get back." And I could not believe that she left. Her father had died, then she got on a plane to come to Israel, then she went back. And she was really not a happy camper, and I just felt that this was not a healthy thing, the way she was having to go through this. But there was no one to say to her, no, you don't go to Israel now. You stay home, right?
Stay home.
But this whole thing, what people have said to me also, the importance of the burial, and I hear what you're saying, that for you, the burial ends the mourning. Right. So in Judaism, burial doesn't end the mourning, but it definitely ends a certain period of time. From the time you hear that the person has died until the burial, there's a limbo situation until that body is in the ground. There's no question. There's an emotional situation that once there's a certain closure that you reach when you stand over the gravesite and you see the burial. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the mourning. It's the end of the limbo. But then, you begin
the mourning.
But one other thing that I wanted to point out that I don't know if you're aware of, but we have a period in our national calendar in the summertime leading up to the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is a fast day. It always falls sometime in July or August, that commemorates the destruction of both temples, because they both were destroyed on the same day or within a few days of each other, and also ended up becoming the anniversary of many, many terrible tragedies that happened to the Jewish people. One of them, for example, the date that the Jews had to be out of Spain, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 was on that date. And there are many other tragedies that befell the Jewish people on that same day. So it's a day of intense mourning. And what happens then is that day, the customs mimic the customs of mourning for a loved one. So also on that day, You don't wear regular shoes. You wear, slippers or socks or beach thongs or whatever. And you don't bathe or shower or anything like that. And of course you fast, which is not something you do in your mourning. That's an added piece. But also we talked about, Tommy, you mentioned that the mourning doesn't end after the week. Then there's a 30-day period during which time you go to work and you go about your business, but you're not going to get a haircut during that time. You're not going to, if you're a man, you're not going to shave. And you're not doing anything of pleasure. You're not going to the movies. You're not going to parties. You're not going to weddings, etc. And then for the remainder of the year, you also, you're dressed normally and whatever, but you're not supposed to buy new clothes, and you're not supposed to go to any celebrations like weddings, parties, or whatever. And this mourning period that we have leading up to the 9th of Av is that as well, because for the 3 weeks leading up to the 9th of Av, no weddings, no parties. Okay, so that whole
so I have a question here. I have a question on that. So Sandra, what you're saying, because I've seen this, I've actually seen this carried out. It can be a real dilemma, because say you've got your son is about to be married that month. It's already, you got the venue, you've got everything done. Right. It's already in place. Right. Your mother dies.
Right.
What do you do?
What
do
you do?
Never, ever, if at all possible, never postpone a wedding. Weddings are considered so important. Well, the whole commandment of be fruitful and multiply that God first said to Adam and Eve is taken very seriously in Judaism. So this whole idea of building a new family and then starting to have children, all that the marriage represents, is something you do not delay. Okay, so yes, the marriage goes forward. What do the parents do? Okay, so I have a friend whose son got married while she was sitting Shiva.
Wow.
She got up from the Shiva. Somebody else wore her dress for half a day, so that when she put on her dress, it was a new dress.
Right.
Okay. And she got up from Shiva, put on the dress, she washed around or whatever, put on the dress, went to the wedding.
Wow.
And then the question is, do you dance or sing? Okay.
Right.
So I think you do very little, but there's also another element, and this is something that is very typical in Judaism when you have competing values. On the one hand, the value is marriage and how important that is, and it's considered a very, very important mitzvah, an important value or commandment to make to bring joy to the bride and groom. So it's a mitzvah to dance and sing with and in front of the bride and groom. So clearly, the bride or groom's joy will be damaged, will be lessened if their own parent can't be part of that joy. So as a result of that, for the time of the wedding, there's certain things that a parent will be allowed to do in order to keep the child happy. Maybe do a dance.
Mitzvah.
Right. But also what very often happens in that kind of a case is that the parent is supposed to also act to a certain degree like the support staff. In other words, they may help serve the meal, so that they're not there, and they probably won't sit in the hall and eat. They probably will have to eat their meal in the hallway, So that's a very difficult situation. It doesn't happen that often, but it has happened. I do remember when my son's bar mitzvah came along, my husband, Ed, was in his year of mourning, not Shiva, not the 30 days, but he was in the year of mourning. And so he was not dancing, and he didn't dance in the bar mitzvah. He maybe did a little one round with his son, but he wasn't participating in the dancing. And I remember my son, my 13-year-old at the time, said afterwards that he felt that the other men in the community didn't dance as much with him. He didn't have as much participation because Ed wasn't dancing and then pulling them in, or, being the natural magnet as the father of the bar mitzvah. And so he had much more dancing with his friends, but not as much dancing of the men of the community. So that's something that happens.
Yeah. Wow.
Right.
Well,
Very interesting.
I have like so many questions. And now I can't think of any of them. No. So one of the things that I think is the most fascinating is, why do you put the body just straight into the ground without a casket, if at all possible? Where does that body go?
Okay, so there's a lot here. Okay, so first of all, a casket is number one unnecessary. There's no reason for it, especially
Right.
what we see in.
Wait a minute. Somebody's making a living off that.
That could be
a big living.
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody's making a lot of money off casket sales.
Right. Well, first of all, embalming, absolutely no way, no how, because you must treat the body exactly as it was. Some of you may have heard of the organization Zaka.
Yep.
Okay, now Zaka today is an organization that does a lot of things having to do with emergency care and whatever. But the way they started is a little bit gruesome, but I'll go to it anyway. The way they started,
I mean, it is gruesome, but it's when you hear it, it's amazing what they do. So
okay, so what happened was, when they started having these horrific terrorist attacks, where they would put bombs, very highly explosive bombs, in buses or in crowded spaces. As you can imagine, the result then is not just death, but body parts flying in every direction. And under Jewish law, every body part is buried, and preferably buried with the whole body. So there was this terrible situation that was really unprecedented. And Zaka began with a number of very religious Jews who volunteered to go to the scene and find the body parts and make sure they all got a real burial. Now, you didn't always know whose body part it belonged to, so you just buried it. But if you have a situation, for example, if somebody was in a car accident and he's killed, and in the process of the car accident, let's say his leg was dismembered or whatever, he will be buried with that leg. Yeah. Now, no one's sewing it on or anything, but it just will be, so the integrity of the body in burials, very important, which is why you will have no embalming process, because that's messing with the natural integrity of the body. So, and of course, that kind of goes in any case with this idea of burying right away, because you can't wait forever if you don't embalm. But okay, so that goes together.
Is there also a belief that in an actual resurrection? I mean, in a Jewish faith, in a resurrection. Yeah.
Right. So there is.
So I mean, that's why people are buried on the Mount of Olives, and that's why they're they want to be in Jerusalem. Right. They want to be.
So that's part of the casket deal as well, because there's this idea of resurrection, there's an idea of somehow the body's moving towards the Mount of Olives or to the land of Israel. How this happens, I can't begin to tell you.
Right. The bones go through the ground. That's what I've always heard. The bones roll through the ground
Yeah. And when I was a kid, I literally pictured these like burrow holes, in Cleveland, Ohio, moving across to Jerusalem, right?
Right.
And by the way, there's a very ancient custom that people would want, even if they lived wherever they lived, they would want to be buried in Jerusalem or in Israel. And what very often people did in ancient times that wasn't practical, they didn't have airplanes to fly bodies in just a few hours to Israel. But what they would do is people who came back from Israel, pilgrims or whatever, very often they would have some dirt, and they would try to bury a bit of the dirt of the land of Israel in with the body when they were burying them.
In America, at a Jewish funeral, they put like a handful of dirt, like Israeli dirt.
Right. So that's something that's often done. And there are people who die in America and arrange to have their bodies flown, to Israel,
right,
to be buried in Israel. So that definitely happens. So what happens with the body? That's part of the thing with the casket. You want to have as little barrier as possible between the body and the earth. Now, we all know that a body decomposes,
Right.
And we need to also remember that the customs of burial that we know today in Jewish customs they have not been like that forever, because during the Second Temple period and before that, the customs were completely different.
Right.
They would bury a body in the earth for a year.
Right.
And then after a year, they would dig up the bones, because that's all that would be left after a year. There'll be complete decomposition. Then they would dig up the bones, put them in some kind of container, and that went into the family vault.
Right. Or like at the time of King David, there wasn't vaults or there wasn't an ossuary, but there was just a big pile of bones, and they laid with their fathers. I mean, like that's what the Bible says.
When you talk about being gathered to my fathers, that refers to that. You die, you're buried, and then your bones are gathered and put next to the bones of the whole family, your fathers, etc. So that's certainly, from biblical times, how it was, and there was a bit of a change in the Second Temple period, but this idea of everybody getting their own plot, that's a fairly modern, invention. But what all of these have in common is no casket, except for that, no casket. So, when I ask myself about this, if you think about it, that they put the bones separately, what does Ezekiel tell us? Ezekiel 38 talks about the bones, right? So nobody's talking about the skin and the muscle. That's gone, okay? Right. But somehow those bones will get themselves to Israel and come to life again. But again, there's no life without the soul.
Right.
So,
sure.
Yeah.
Now, I had a question from a friend that she wanted to know what was a Jewish thought on heaven versus hell.
Like, where do we go when we die?
Right. Yes. And do Jews believe in hell?
Oh yeah, we believe in heaven. We believe in hell, but we haven't first of all, hell. I know there's a lot of Christian traditions with a very graphic description of hell, and I just know from reading literature of some of these, particularly in colonial period in the United States, and all these Puritans and whatever.
Yes.
Lord, right. So there was a lot of what we call, hellfire and brimstone kind of stuff. We never did that. We do believe that hell is a nasty place, and there are traditions of it being very hot and very fires and whatever, but it's just a place you don't want to be. Heaven is a place you do want to be. And it is described as a place where you're coming near to God, and where the righteous people sit, and you're basking in the glory of God, and maybe even studying the Bible with God and the angels and whatever. Okay, so, and again, as a child, you have a very stark visual conception of this, but as you get older, you realize, it's not physical in that way. These are spiritual existences, because it's happening to the soul. It's not happening to the body. But we do believe that there is an afterlife. And we do believe that when God talks about reward and punishment in the Bible, that is not necessarily meted out in our ordinary lives. And that's one of the ways that we can understand. If you see an evil person and who lives a good life, you would say, well, wait, whatever happened to God saying he's going to punish evil people? So the balance of that happens in the next life. So that's the expectation. A person who's evil, if he's not necessarily punished in this life, he's going to be punished in the next life. But we're all very, very careful not to go around judging and figuring out who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, because we're not God.
Right.
So we really, really don't know that at all.
Amen.
You just gotta let the Christians do that.
There are no formulas, and there's no such thing as only Jews get heaven. Nah, Jews get heaven, but so can non-Jews. It's all a question of what God decides, and based on your merits and based on your character and your good deeds.
That's interesting. Yeah, I would like to, because I think even in our Bibles, it's not most of the it's not talked about in Jewish funerals, at least the Jewish funerals that I've been to, but in Christianity, everybody's going to heaven. I've even the worst of people I've never been to a funeral where the pastor or somebody says, this guy's rotten in hell. He's just, he was just a low life scum. And but I'm sure they wouldn't probably do that in Jewish circles either, but just for the respect of the family. But what I have heard is that, and this is a very interesting concept, that so we started off, with the Garden of Eden. Started off with this communion with God. We've got this relationship with God. The process, it seems to me, through this process of God making a promise to Abraham, choosing a people, choosing a place, a land, choosing Jerusalem, choosing a place where him to a dwelling place for God, choosing a kingship that would enable that dwelling place for God, a Messiah that would bring the dwelling place of God in Jerusalem. But then I hear in the Jewish understanding is that the ultimate goal then is to get back to this Garden of Eden, because now we have this. This is the, when we talk about Israel, even the whole world's looking at Israel going, it's like the Garden of Eden. It's like, because I'm putting a plug in for HaYovel now, so we're participating in Israel's going to be,
Yeah.
but there's a place here. There's a place here where the whole world needs to get involved in this narrative, like, because the Jewish people also, even as uncomfortable as it is now, are looking at the nations to come and be part of this. And it's kind of hard, because I think in Christianity we put everything in boxes. Are we talking about heaven? Are we talking about Israel's restoration? Are we talking about? And sometimes I think we blur those lines. And I'd like to hear, kind of from a Jewish perspective, what's the end goal here? What is it? Are we just, we're doing good, we're going to hang out with God, we make sure we got a volleyball court up there, and we're going to be, playing volleyball or soccer or whatever, and having a grand old time. But really, it's a desire. It seems like to me the ultimate desire is to get back to that Garden of Eden. Is that?
You're 100% right. There is that idea of getting back to a utopia, a perfect world, which would be represented by the Garden of Eden. Now, it's interesting because in Judaism, you have a term that is called Olam Haba, the world to come, that is often used interchangeably to refer to the heaven that everybody goes to when they're dead, and the future world to come after Messiah comes and we have this utopian Garden of Eden kind of place. And those terms, very often the same term is used for both of those concepts. And it's kind of, it may even be related, because if you think about this concept of resurrection, it could be that the world to come, which is a parallel universe to what we are now, where you have these righteous souls that will be resurrected on earth, because essentially the earth will become the world to come. Now, there are different Jewish scholars over the ages that debated what was the Messianic age going to look like, and some of them saw it as different stages, and some of them just had different visions. And so there was this concept that really the world to come is a physical world, just like our world today, except people will behave themselves, and we're not going to have war, and we're not going to have one nation enslaving another nation, and people will be free, and people will be universal in their belief and worship of the one God of Israel. But that nature exists, although you still wonder, nature exists. In other words, there is a lion and a lamb, but naturally lions eat lambs. So what does it mean? How does that happen that lions and lambs exist, but they're
seems like we have a lot of people eating people right now too.
And also that's the same thing with war. I mean, human nature, I don't think we're necessarily evil by nature, but it is a very natural phenomenon that people go to war when they can't agree on something. And how is that going to suddenly change? So how that happens, who knows? Okay, but that's part of the concept. And then there's this idea of a spiritual world that none of these physical realities will be relevant anymore. Well, all I can say at the end of the day is your guess is as good as mine. Judaism leaves this all open to interpretation.
You can't say that in Christianity.
Yeah, well.
We have absolute truth.
Mommy, don't you know that?
Sandra, absolute truth. There is no vague anything. You know, 30,000 different absolute truths, and they're all right.
That's
They're all
right.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've heard my share of Christians debating yes and no to rapture, which I find very interesting, but okay. But it's the same idea. Okay, when Christians say yes or no rapture, is exactly the same principle. None of us know what it's going to look like. You take a text and you try to interpret it as you understand it, but no one's been there and back to report. Not from heaven, and certainly we haven't yet reached, the latter days. So
yeah,
I guess we'll just wait and see.
You keep hanging out with us.
Okay.
We got it.
I'll tell you one thing that's very interesting. The funeral ceremony itself at the burial, there's a few things that are very interesting that happen that I think relate to this. First of all, the Kaddish prayer is very central to the whole mourning period. It is said several times as you escort the dead body to the cemetery and as you bury. And this is traditionally said by the mourners themselves. And the prayer itself says nothing about death. People think Kaddish, they think death, but the prayer itself is purely sanctifying and glorifying God's name. That's all it is. It's a beautiful, beautiful poem, essentially, glorifying and sanctifying God's name. And the relation to death is very similar to what we talked about earlier about not leaving the body out because that's a desecration of God's name. Any death, to some degree, is a desecration of God's name because someone in the image of God has now died and lost its soul. And so there's this feeling of need to compensate for that by, sanctifying God's name. But it's also connected to a prayer, a blessing that every mourner says when they bury. They say, and even it's become a custom that you say it when you hear someone has died. You say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. We bless the judge of truth. And that is a lesson that the judge of truth is, or the true judge, I would say, that is God. So basically, there's a need to accept that this is God's judgment, and whether a person died at 95 years old and his time had come, or whether it was a tragic taking of a young person through a terrorist attack, no matter what, you have to make this blessing where you basically say, I accept God's judgment, and what he has judged and what he has decided is true. Okay, but you're not saying, everything is hunky-dory. Right. It doesn't matter that he died because he went home to be with the Lord. Nobody will ever say that. We do believe that his soul is up in heaven, but we are not denying the pain that we feel and the fact that we have lost this person. And that's something that I find very different from what I've encountered in Christian circles. And another thing that is an interesting custom is you turn to the dead person, so to speak, okay, and you say, please, when you go up to heaven, you're addressing the soul as it's departing on its way to heaven. And you turn to the dead person, you say, please, will you intercede on our behalf with God? Now, this is a very, you can't take this literally, okay? You can't. But what this basically is, the idea being that you believe this person, this soul has an afterlife, has an after existence, and he will be up there with God. And if there's any way that soul can, kind of boost our prayers along kind of thing, that's something that we do. And of course, and I know Christians say this also, I know they're looking down on us. They're, I feel their presence from above, things like that. That's also very common in Judaism, that same sense.
What about this is a tough one, but I think it's important for Christians to understand it, because I didn't understand it until I got involved and had some conversations with you. But one of the atrocities of the Holocaust was the crematorium, and just why was that just like the final affront, or the final tragedy that happened?
Well,
What?
there's no burial, and there's nothing left but ash.
Yeah.
So I would say on a human level, there are people who are very upset because they don't have a focus for their mourning. Like you talked about going to the cemetery and sitting in front of the grave of your grandmother. And that's a human need to,
Right.
We all know that the grandmother's not there anymore. Her body, but it becomes a focus of your mourning. It's a place where you can be and come and remember that person and see something. So at the most basic level, there's no grave. But if you go back to some of these other thoughts that we talked about, the idea of resurrection and the bones making their way, and no barrier, so no casket, and all these things, the sanctity of the body itself, and this body is turned to ash, which is also why cremation is so frowned upon. Now, I know there are some very, very secular Jews today, not so much in Israel, but abroad, who do cremate. It's still considered very taboo in most Jewish circles. But that's where it's coming from, the sanctity of the body and the expectation of resurrection. Now, I 100% believe that the fact that these wonderful Jews were burned in the crematorium has no effect whatsoever on whether or not they'll be resurrected.
For sure.
Clear to me that God doesn't need those bones.
Yeah.
He really doesn't. But I think that was part of that's part of this idea that it goes against so much of what our tradition was. But I'll point out something else. There is this idea, and I know in Christianity it's a similar idea. This idea of being buried in sacred ground is something that many Christians talk about. I don't know if that's only in Catholic circles or in other Christian circles as well. In Jewish circles, there is this idea of being buried properly according to Jewish traditions in a Jewish cemetery with all the normal customs. And that's so important. It is the reason why Israel has paid prices to get back dead bodies from terrorist organizations.
Right.
And I personally think sometimes the prices are way too high. I can understand paying a high price when you're going to release a live person, although even that is problematic because very often when you release a terrorist, that terrorist will then go and murder hundreds more people, and you saved one person and you murdered hundreds more. But, how do you say that to a family? A family who knows their son is alive in the hands of Hamas, But you see also this kind of price being paid for bodies. Sometimes it's about closure. Of being able to say, yes, I saw that dead body, or someone was able to test the remains and say, yes, this is the right DNA and it is him and he's definitely dead. So that's certainly important, but I think it goes beyond that because you hear the families over and over saying the same thing. I want to bring them to a proper Jewish burial in Israel. And so that also is something that's it's an important value.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was interesting, when we evacuated all of the Jewish communities out of Gush Katif, sadly, one of the things I hadn't thought of and that I didn't understand as part of that process was they evacuated all of the graves, including, I believe, some that were like hundreds of years old.
I don't know about that. I don't know hundreds, but
like ancient cemetery, but certainly the modern day cemetery, like everybody left Gush Katif. They didn't leave anybody behind for desecration.
Right. So that's where it came from, so that they shouldn't be desecrated. But at that point, I was very disturbed about that. I didn't like that. And I, at that point, told my husband that if something would happen, if I were buried anywhere in the land of Israel, do not move me. And I'll tell you where I find why. Because today, archaeologists dig all over Israel and they find Jewish graves. And that's how we know that Jews live there. Jewish graves, Jewish bones tell us the Jews live there. And I don't care about desecrating my grave because I'm not there. I'm just not that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not there. But I want someone to know if for whatever reason, Karnei Shomron will one day be evacuated. God forbid, it should never happen. But if one day Karnei Shomron will be evacuated and I have already gone and been buried there, don't move me, because I want 100 or 200 years from now for someone to know Jews lived here and were buried here. So that's my personal feeling on that.
There you go.
That's a good one.
We witnessed that. We're here. I'm writing it down right now.
Okay.
It's not going to happen.
Okay. No, it's
Not
not
going
going
to
to
happen.
happen.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. I want to say too that because I just heard today as we're talking about it, and I think it would just be fitting to just say, because the anniversary of the death of Rena Schwerb, the young lady that was beautiful young girl, 17-year-old, was murdered. We still have these deals, these issues, and it's sad that, and I think it's important for Christianity, who probably even is that are maybe watching this, maybe never even heard of her, never would know her name. Everybody in Israel knows who she is.
Right.
And so I think it's important for us as Christians, as Bible believers, and people that believe that this is a God thing that's happening in Israel, that the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel is not something, it's not happenstance. It's not just something that just happened out of the blue. But we have to turn a corner here. The Christian community needs to be able to stop these kind of things from happening. And I think that would be good for us to mourn for this young lady. If you go online and look at her, she's just an amazing woman, young lady, and the people that talked about her even a year ago. My son Luke and Olivia, my daughter, my son-in-law Luke, they named their child Rena after her, after the baby. Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that as we're talking about that this is means something to us, and I think that it really needs to mean something to the rest of Christianity. This is something that's happening in our lifetime, the restoration of Israel. It's not a time that we're not having this program. I'm just going to say, we're not having this program to fight each other or to learn how to. We're having this program so that we learn how to respect and be in awe. Really, for us to be in awe that the Jewish people came back, that they gave their lives. There's a lot of bodies here in Israel now that weren't here, 100 years ago. But because they gave their lives to see this country founded, was significant. And I believe that God is not going to is going to remember these people that gave their lives and gave their shed their blood for the restoration of this land, which was promised by Abraham almost 4,000 years ago, and the promise is coming true in our lifetime. So I just think it's an amazing thing. I would encourage our Christian brothers and sisters to get behind the miracle. And right now, to me, just to use a phrase, it's game time. It's time for us to get on board with this deal. We've got this is the comeback story of the ages. The Jews, the bones are coming together from the ashes of the Holocaust, and we're seeing a miracle here. Amen. And so I really appreciate your telling us and talking to us about this, Sandra, and it does give us, I think, for Christians, it challenges us to be respectful of our loved ones, people that are. We need to be. We need to have these stuff. I so cherish that, and I'm actually gleaning that. If you don't, and I hope it's not offensive for me to, even remember my own dad, an anniversary of that. To remember him on a yearly basis, and to gather with my own family and remember my dad.
It's beautiful.
Try not to get too emotional here, but this is such a beautiful thing. It is an amazing thing, and I appreciate it very much. We have a lot to learn, and I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And I hope we can continue these programs and to talk about a lot more things to come. So, but I just really appreciated that. And I just wanted to mention, I just saw this before we got on the program today, that the anniversary of Rena's death, and wanted to kind of I wanted to mention that on this program especially.
I'm glad you did, Tommy. That was really moving. And yes, and I want to just reiterate what you're saying. We do and we can learn from one another.
Yeah.
And I would
Amen.
say definitely, one of the things I would second that wholeheartedly, Tommy. One of the greatest things that I saw on I don't even remember which trip, but whatever. When I came to Israel, when I looked around and everywhere you go, what I saw and what really impacted me was how Jews react or counteract death with life. Because when someone passes away, whether just naturally or in tragedy, it doesn't matter. They're like that. That's not so important. But there is this need, this drive to do something in their memory and to create life from, based on just to continue them. So you see it in the naming of children based on that, and you see it in not so much monuments. I think in Christianity, like we build these monuments, but in Israel, like they build like stuff, like not just a monument, but it's a it's a park. It's something that people enjoy, people can use. It's a value, and it just furthers their memory, and that impacted me so much just to see how like their lives weren't in vain, I guess. And then it continues on, and then it keeps going. So very much so.
I just want to, you remind me now, and I think we'll just end with this, but many, many years ago when I was in high school, we had a rabbi who said something very interesting on this issue. He said, Jewish tradition does not celebrate birthdays. And that's true. Birthdays is something we took on from Western society. It's a nice thing. It's great. But it's not a traditional Jewish thing. He says, we celebrate or we commemorate the Yortzeit, the anniversary of someone's death. Really? Why are you doing that? Because it's only at the end of someone's life that we can appreciate who they were and what they accomplished. The fact that you were born, so what? You didn't do anything to get born, But the question is, what do you do with your life? And it is what you have done with your life that will live on after you. It's the teachings that you gave and the people that you loved, the things you accomplished for the good of society. That is what lives on. And I think that's something that all of us can really appreciate. And it really sums up a lot of what we were talking about today.
Definitely.
Amen.
Okay.
In Christianity, it's that dash, like on the gravestone, they have the date of birth and the date of death, and it's the dash. What happened in between? That's what matters.
That's great.
There you go.
Absolutely.
That's good.
There you go. Anyway, great to you all today.
Yeah, it was great. Wonderful. I can't wait to get together again.
Amen.
Great.
Look forward.
See you all soon.
Bye-bye.
All right.